So it seems like lately we've been talking a lot about how bad Europe is. The German industrial collapse, French debt, the bureaucracy of the European Union. Everything seems to be going from bad to worse. But what if we told you that in this whole story there is one big exception, a country you've likely not heard much about, but one which has been breaking records? Today we're going to be talking about Slovenia. Slovenia's growth in recent years has been spectacular. Up until the 90s, it was a poor, socialist country under the umbrella of the former Yugoslavia. But in just 3 decades, it has already become wealthier than Spain. And we're not just talking about economic growth. Slovenia is also one of the most egalitarian countries on the planet, and it's always at the top of all these lists, measuring sustainability, human development, and whatever else you can imagine. Now, could you tell me how this country has become so rich in such a short period of time? Well, no, it hasn't been by fleetingly opening up to the market economy, nor by using special economic zones, nor even by attracting large foreign investments. Its key to success has been very different from that of other countries such as Poland or Estonia. So the questions are clear. What did Slovenia do to become so rich? How long will its accelerated economic expansion last? In this video, I'll tell you all about it. Slovenia's history goes back many years, but we have to start somewhere, and there's no better starting point than Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia's history dates back to the end of the Second World War, when it came under the command of socialist leader Josip Broz Tito. And I know what many of you are thinking, another satellite state of the USSR. Well, no. Yugoslavia stood out for trying to remain neutral throughout the Cold War, and Tito was not Stalin. Tito abolished the figure of the capitalist as such, and gave control of all companies to the workers. However, these workers were more or less autonomous in running their businesses, and in practice, many continued to operate under the same boss as previously. In other words, the Yugoslav economy never reached the level of planning that the USSR did. There was no ministry to decide how many screws to produce or how many hectares of land to devote to grain. Its economy was also much more open to Western powers. For example, Italy and Germany accounted for 40% of all its exports, and although 60% of prices were controlled, there was still a part of the market that was moderately free. Obviously, the state-owned enterprises did not compete in a perfectly free market as under capitalism, as is typical in socialist systems. They were not very productive either. For example, in the 1980s, the losses of the enterprises averaged 15%. You could say that companies spent more time trying to win political favors than to become productive, and if they went bankrupt, they could always wait for a bailout. But in spite of this, and thanks to greater freedom, the Yugoslav republics performed much better economically than their Soviet cousins. To give you an idea, when the Berlin Wall fell, Poland's per capita income was barely 1/3 of the European average, while Slovenia's was 2/3. Even so, this huge difference was not only due to the fact that Yugoslavia had a freer market. Within Tito's regime, there were very significant differences between territories. And guess which territory was the richest? Exactly, the part we know today as Slovenia. And the difference is not small. At the beginning of the Tito era, Slovenia was already the richest region. Croatia, the second richest, barely reached 65% of its wealth, and this difference remained practically unchanged throughout the socialist period. Slovenia had only 8% of the Yugoslav population, but contributed 20% of the entire GDP and 30% of exports. What's more, the difference became even greater when these countries became independent. And here is the first difference with other emerging countries such as Poland. The starting point. Slovenia was much richer than Poland and the rest of its socialist neighbors. But here is the most important difference. If Poland was the clearest example of the shock doctrine of making the transition to capitalism as quickly as possible in the style of Javier Milei, Slovenia opted for gradualism.
The reality since independence has been an even more gradual transition than even the most enthusiastic gradualists had envisioned.
Slovenia was already relatively rich, so it could afford to slow down. And since its economy was not so dependent on other Soviet countries, it also didn't suffer such a severe shock from the fall of the USSR. On top of that, although the Yugoslav companies had large deficits, the truth is that the republics had surprisingly balanced accounts, which gave them much more room for maneuver than the Poles. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that Slovenia didn't have any problems. In the 1980s, Yugoslavia was in crisis. Annual output growth was a dismal 0.6%. Unemployment had reached 14%, and the biggest problem, inflation, reached 2,800% in 1989. If you add to all this the fact that other regions such as Serbia kept trying to get their hands on their finances, you will surely understand why they were so eager to become independent. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. First mission following independence, launching their own currency, the tolar. I remember how we just told you that Slovenia Slovenia was very gradualist. Well, with the monetary reform they made an exception, because they changed the whole monetary base in just a few days. The exchange rate was 1-to-1 with the dinar, their previous currency, so most conversions were automatic. Mind you, the tolar was much better managed and more open to the rest of the world. The result? Well, you could see it on the screen. While the rest of Yugoslavia ended up with 100% hyperinflation per month, Slovenia not only kept inflation at bay, but reduced it from 20% to 2%. To put this in context, this is a reduction quite similar to the drop in inflation during Milei's first year. But the reforms didn't end there. Public spending fell from 49% to 41%. This is still a rather high figure for the time, but the fact remains that there were cutbacks and restructuring of the government sector. The next significant reform was trade reform. Yes, Slovenia was already much more open to trade than other Soviet bloc countries, but it was still far from European standards. And here they did a very smart thing. Yugoslav politicians knew that there were three paths to economic growth: investment and more investment. The USSR, for example, invested much more than the USA, but of course, if you manufacture 1 million tractors and only 10 engines, that investment ends up pretty useless. Thus, Slovenia's tariff policy was based on two key ideas. The first was to lower most tariffs in order to increase trade. There was a very strong increase in tariffs to agriculture, but this sector has a proportion of less than 4% of the entire economy. Thus, the rate of protection of all goods in the economy fell from 30% to 6%. And the second idea was to further lower tariffs on capital goods. That is, to make buying products for investment, such as machines, cheaper than buying for consumption. In a sense, it was as if they had used tariffs to penalize consumption in favor of investment. This has a great advantage. Consumption taxes are much better for economic growth than other taxes, because they don't affect the creation and development of companies so much, and the Slovenians were very, very clear about this. However, there was still one major reform package left: privatizations. Slovenia passed a series of laws that put an end to workers running all the companies, basically giving a lot of control to the company manager. But the truth is that it was still not very clear who was the owner, who could take home the profits, and who was responsible for deciding whether or not to fire a worker, for instance. What's more, politicians could not agree on how to privatize these companies, so they were up to 3 major laws. The outcome, in the end, they opted for a share model. 20% were given away to employees, 40% to institutional investors, and 40% was sold to anyone else. As well as this, it should be noted that some of the shares destined for institutional funds ended up being given away to ordinary people, or pension funds, and a few were also earmarked to compensate the victims of Tito's expropriations. The fact is that it took quite a few years for this law to be passed, and the process was very, very slow. Even so, government employment also fell by 8.5%, but this was due more to the new private companies that emerged than to the privatization of fully state-owned companies. The result is that almost 10 years after independence, 84% of all employment still occurred in socialized enterprises, although it was still more autonomous than during the previous regime. What's more, Slovenia was very protectionist regarding the shares of these companies, and barely allowed foreign companies to enter the country. To give some more figures, during the first decade of independence, foreign investment only exceeded 1% of GDP in 1997. Again, this is the opposite of what Poland did. And I know what you're all waiting for. What was the outcome of all these policies? Slovenia was the second fastest growing country in ex-socialist Europe in the 1990s, only behind Poland. But keep one thing in mind, Slovenia was much, much, much richer than Poland, so it's to be expected that its growth was lower. If we take this into account, Slovenian growth was even better than Polish growth. In short, following its independence from Yugoslavia, Slovenia implemented some very radical reforms, but also followed a very, very gradualist path in key sectors such as the labour market and business ownership. Nevertheless, all that glitters is not gold. So far we've been talking about the first decade following independence, the 1990s, but the decade after that was not so kind to the Slavic country, and joining the European Union is like a shot of economic adrenaline for any country. And yet, the gap with Poland has been getting much, much smaller in recent years. Or to put it another way, Slovenia did do better than Poland during the initial years, but since then, Warsaw has beaten them by a landslide. The culprit? Well, it's partly to Poland's credit, which has managed to maintain very high economic growth rates despite becoming richer every year. But if you look closely, the main reason is Slovenia's stagnation since the 2008 crisis, with a GDP per capita that took 10 years to recover. Keep in mind that Slovenia is a very small country, barely bigger than Barcelona. What's more, exports are quite important in its economy, mainly of medicines and car parts, so a slowdown in the global economy was bound to affect it. Does this mean that Slovenia was not to blame for anything? Not at all. Slovenia is a developed country, with good growth rates and very solid public accounts, with a public debt of just 70% of of GDP, but it also has some problems that could be weighing down its economy. For example, do you remember the gradualism in its privatizations? The direct consequence of this has been that in Slovenia there are hardly any large companies. 99% of Slovenian companies are SMEs, and 85% are micro SMEs, with fewer than 10 workers. And yes, Slovenia has leading companies such as the pharmaceutical company Krka, but let's be honest, innovation in this country is quite low, which explains why its productivity has been stagnating for more than a decade compared to the EU average. On top of that, it is the OECD country where venture capital, the funds that invest in startups, is the scarcest. The reason? Well, it's due to a too slow transition from the socialist banking system to a market one. But this is not all. Productivity is growing very slowly, even without comparing it to other countries, but wages are growing well above productivity. This means that companies have to pay more and more wages, even though they don't generate more money from their workers, so their margin for investing is smaller. This is because Slovenia has labor laws that protect wages, particularly the minimum wage, which is the most generous in the OECD. And no, this does not translate into unemployment. In fact, companies have a huge labor shortage. According to an OECD study, 40% of companies say they have problems finding workers. Of course, this is not only because the labor market is so healthy despite its very high wage costs. The Slovenian government is 100% committed to green transformation, digital transformation, and, well, all those things. So what's the problem? The problem is that it doesn't have trained workers capable of carrying out all these projects. Adults are barely trained once they have finished their studies, and the skills of workers in new technologies rank at the bottom of all the OECD countries, 10 times lower than the average. But if stagnating productivity and ambitious targets with no means to meet them worry economists, there is one other issue that is much more pressing: pensions. Slovenia currently spends 10% of its GDP on pensions, somewhat below the European average. But this will not be the case for much longer. According to the Aging Report commissioned by the European Commission, Slovenia is 4th on the list of EU countries whose pension expenditure will rise the most by 2070, almost 4 points more of GDP. This would put Slovenia among the countries that have to spend the most of its money on pensions in the European Union. For now, the economy is holding up pretty well. Yes, in the last 20 years, it has done considerably worse than Poland. That doesn't mean the Slovenians have done badly. Even so, stagnant productivity coupled with the pension boom is the perfect formula for catastrophe. Fortunately, pension reforms are not foreign to this country. For instance, during the first decade of independence, the retirement age for men rose from 56 years and 2 months to 59 years and 11 months. Moreover, even if their automotive industry suffers from the electric car, their exports are quite diversified, and they still have a very large public debt margin, so everything indicates that this country will still be able to maintain quite high living standards. Although, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't expect a boom like the Polish one. Did you know that Slovenia was already richer than Spain? Which economic model do you think is better, the Slovenian or the Polish one? Will it be an impediment to economic growth, or will it manage to overcome all the problems we've mentioned? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.